Are you sitting comfortably?
Oh, yes, yes.
Then I'll begin.
Even when you're just sitting around, we're rocking the talk.
Today's News Talk Radio,
TNT.
All right, welcome back. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to TNT, Today's News Talk. We're still in hour number 1 of this live broadcast. I hope you guys can join us. For the rest of the program, we'll be going 2 hours with a lot of news and analysis, especially in the second hour. We're going to be covering breaking news. We're going to get hot takes and updates from our research assistant, also possibly from our commentator, Basil Valentine. Much, much more coming. But right now, we've got a very important discussion that we're going to open up here. And I want to welcome on to the program a fantastic, I would say, authority in the area of propaganda and communications at the government level, especially in times of war and the mass media. David Miller is going to join us right now. He is also the co-host of a great program which appears on Press TV, Palestine Declassified. He's joining us on the line right now. David, how are you?
I'm very well, thank you, Patrick.
Thanks a lot for joining us, David. I really appreciate it. David, we haven't had a discussion on this program yet, I believe, about what's transpired over the last 10 weeks. I think it's important to open up. I'd like to get your general comments. Looking back now, we're 3 weeks, over 10 weeks into this current phase of this incredible historic event, this crisis that's unfolding, and it's horrific on so many levels. I'd like to get your just opening statement, your general thoughts and observations about what has transpired and what you think it means in the broader historical context of this region of the world. And then we're going to get into the topic of propaganda, because this has just been the most incredible roller coaster of disinformation and propaganda. But David, I'll open up the floor to you on the general subject from October 7th forward. Go ahead.
Well, I guess, anytime I'm asked about what I think about October the 7th or what happened after it, I would want to say, well, of course, it didn't start on October the 7th, and it didn't even start in 1947-48 with the Nakba and the displacement of 750,000 Palestinians. It started, in fact, in the 1840s, 1850s, when the first Zionist settlements, weren't even called Zionist at that stage, were started. And since then, there's been a constant process of escalating ethnic cleansing, culminating, of course, first of all in the Nakba, as I said, in 48, and then, of course, in the Naksa in 1967, when the Golan and Gaza and the West Bank and East Jerusalem, as well as the Sinai Desert, were taken by the Israelis. And, of course, the Sinai was given back as part of the deal which was made with the Egyptians, which, of course, has been part of the history of the horror and ongoing ethnic cleansing against the Palestinians ever since. So that's the big picture. This is an imposed settler colony, predominantly of white European Jews. Of course, since then, the Mossad in particular took steps to make sure that many millions of other Jews came to what's called Israel from North Africa, from West Asia, and they did that by essentially threatening and scaring them out, so that now they can say that a bare majority, an almost majority, are white Europeans, and then there are a whole series of others who are what was called Arab Jews back in the day. They're now called Mizrahim, to give them some kind of Zionist take. So there's a complicated story here, but in some ways it's not complicated. This is a Zionist settler colony which has always intended to remove the Palestinians. They intended to do that from the 1920s and 30s onwards, and they've continued to want to do that. And we've seen that in the plans which have emerged since October the 7th, which have been leaked from various ministries and think tanks, showing that they want to push them out, the Palestinians in Gaza, out to the Sinai, across the Rafah crossing. And indeed, as we've seen in the news recently, they're trying to push them out to the Democratic Republic of Congo and to many other places too, to try and solve the Palestinian problem once and for all, as they would see it. But to go back to your question, so October the 7th, of course, was the Palestinian resistance factions led by the Qassam brigades, the military wing of Hamas, because let's remember, Hamas is not a military organization. It's a political resistance movement, which has a military wing, and is engaged with, along with 9 other factions. And they broke out of what everyone has called an open-air prison, has been an open-air prison since they disengaged in 2005. And their objective, of course, was, yes, to kill soldiers, and secondly, to take hostages, which they did reasonably effectively. And of course, there's a whole series of questions about what else happened that day, which I guess we'll come to in a minute. But immediately after that prison break, a daring prison break, which according to all accounts, although there is some dispute about this, took the Israelis by some surprise. And of course, since then, Israel has decided to indulge a bloodlust, essentially, to attack the Palestinians, claiming to be interested in attacking and defeating Hamas, but of course, transparently, actually just being interested in either bombing and killing Palestinians, or through the bombing and killing, frightening the rest away to displace them so they can remove them from Gaza altogether. And they haven't really appreciably dented the command structure of Hamas, or indeed any of the other Palestinian resistance factions. The most significant attack they've done has been in the last couple of days, where they killed a Hamas deputy leader in Beirut, and indeed 2 Qassam Brigade's commanders. That seems to have been the most significant loss that Hamas as a movement has had since October the 7th. So we can see perfectly well that while they have demolished 70% of all buildings in Gaza, they haven't managed to demolish even 1% of Hamas's command structure. So we can see perfectly well that the objective has not been to destroy Hamas. And in fact, even if it had been their objective, we have seen since they went into the ground offensive that they have been remarkably ineffective in destroying or degrading either the capacity of Qassam Brigade and Hamas more widely, or the other resistance factions, because we still have every day rockets being fired, including from within parts of North Gaza, which are supposed to be under the control of the occupation forces. So we can see that we have you want the big picture. We have a situation in which the Israelis are losing, and in a context where the world is moving from unipolarity, where the writ of the US runs, to multipolarity, where the US's word is not the law anymore. And so we have a desperate situation as far as the Israelis are concerned, that they want to find a way to make sure that the US will support them, because they can't carry on without US support, as we've already seen. And the US is becoming increasingly reluctant to openly support them, or to come in directly on their side in a conflict. And the reason for that is not because they have any great sense of not wanting to be part of genocide. They're already up to their blood-stained necks in the genocide. But the reason for that is that the US is scared. Even although they have a kind of ideology of empire at all costs, they are scared. Let me give you the 2 reasons why I think that's the case, just to conclude. Which is, first of all, the Operation Protect Prosperity, which was launched when the Ansar Allah movement, the government of Yemen, quarantined the whole Red Sea and closed down the Israeli port of Eilat. And as a result, the US had this coalition, which they said was going to kick the ass, I suppose the Americans would say, of Ansar Allah. And immediately the US Navy said, we haven't got enough boats for this. Secondly, the French, the Germans, and the Italians said, we're not going to be under US command, we're out. And thirdly, the US admitted in the pages of the New York Times, no less, that they were a little bit reluctant to sink Ansar Allah boats, or to attack Yemen directly, because what might happen is that Ansar Allah might sink US boats, and of course they would. And so they decided they weren't going to attack them, really. And of course, they have done a small attack, killed 10 fighters the other day on 3 speedboats. But the US is scared of engaging fully with Ansar Allah. And of course, almost immediately after that, which is my second example, the US indicated that its second aircraft carrier was going to be moving away from the Eastern Mediterranean and back towards the West. So the US is not a dependable ally, and the Israelis are therefore desperate to bring them into the conflict. And that's why we've had in the last week the attack in Beirut, the assassination of the senior IRGC commander in Damascus, the attack, the massive bombing in Iran, which has killed, I think, more than 90 people at the occasion of the 4th anniversary of the assassination of Qasem Soleimani, the widely regarded commander of the Quds Force, which has been responsible for the creation of the axis of resistance throughout the region. And of course, lastly, the fourth thing, the attack on the Iraqi resistance as well. So that's a very wide-scale attack, obviously directly by the Israelis and indirectly by the Israelis in each case. And of course, the intention is to cause Ansarullah and Iran and the Iraqi resistance and Hezbollah to escalate in order that the Israelis can bring the Americans to the front. And now I think that is destined to fail, but I'm going to stop there and let you ask me another question.
Well, I think you've opened up. Let's just round off the big picture there, which you've opened up that discussion, because I think it's an important discussion, especially going into the new year or going into 2024, and that is one of the big trends that we and others have identified. Is we're seeing the emergence of this multipolar world, and the beginnings of it. You could say, what are the green shoots, to use a common political term they like to use for the economy, the green shoots of a multipolar world. But it's interesting, the Middle East, David, all those things that you just mentioned there, mostly all of those actors, be they state or non-state, they are kind of working independently on their own volition. There is some coordination and understanding, I'm sure, at some level, but it's not as if you're dealing with a monolithic bloc here, which makes it very difficult, I think, for the United States, which itself is a monolithic imperialist bloc, to manage all of these different obstacles and problems simultaneously. It's really unworkable, and I think that's a reality that is just slowly seeping in Washington. Not yet there, but slowly seeping in. So, are we looking at a new Middle East, David?
Well, when you say green shoots, of course, what's happened across West Asia is part of that process, but we've been seeing this process, as you and as everyone knows, over the past 2 years through the NATO and misadventures in the Ukraine, which have now coming to a conclusion, falling apart rapidly, Russian gains across the front, and the Ukrainians being left with no uncertainty that actually the US and the rest of the allies are not going to be continuing to support them, and that they have, in fact, in the end, lost. That they will have to concede territory. Now, if anyone thinks that that's going to end with simply 4 areas of Ukraine ceded to Russia, which have already voted in referenda to join Russia, then they need to be thinking a little bit larger than that, because that's not what's going to happen. But the key thing is that Ukraine and what's happening in West Asia are both green shoots of the multipolar world, and of course we see that at a bigger economic and geopolitical level with the advances of the BRICS. The Saudis have just joined as of the 1st of January. The Iranians are now part of the BRICS. There are all sorts of other countries vying to become part of the BRICS, and of course there's the whole question of de-dollarization and all those processes, which we could talk about at length as well, and they are running in parallel. And of course, you have when you see what's happening in West Asia and the kind of clamp that Yemen has on the Red Sea, and we saw, I think the other day, the Iranians being responsible for stopping boats coming in through the Straits of Gibraltar. In the Western Mediterranean, and we've also seen boats being attacked as far east as the Indian Ocean, and so it looks like when you say there's not a central coordination. They're not a single bloc. Well, of course, that's true. They're not a single bloc, and they have independence. And October the 7th was a Palestinian venture. It wasn't ordered from Tehran, etc. But nevertheless, the axis of resistance is an actual coordinating body, such that, for example, both in Gaza, there is a coordination room where all of the 10 military factions fighting the Israelis coordinate on a daily basis. And we have to assume, because this was the case in 2020 and 2021, that there's a coordination room in Beirut, which of course was where the deputy leader of Hamas was assassinated and the two Qassam brigade commanders were assassinated. There's a coordination room in Beirut, which of course features representatives of all of the Palestinian factions, of Hezbollah in Lebanon, and indeed of the Quds Force of the Islamic Republic's Guards Corps. And I would imagine too that the Popular Mobilization Squads, the Hashd al-Shabi of Iraq is involved in that. And let's remember that in Iraq there are themselves something like 22 or 23 different armed factions currently fighting the Americans and indeed the Israelis. And maybe pause for a second on this because people don't necessarily know. There are, of course, US bases in Syria, illegal US bases in Syria. There are US bases in Iraq. And of course, there are Israeli bases in the Golan Heights, which of course is territorially part of Syria, but which is occupied by Israel. And if you can think of your geography of the area, you've got Lebanon, and then you've got Syria, and then you've got Jordan, and you've got Iraq. Now, some of the Iraqi resistance people are firing missiles into the Golan Heights and into American bases in Syria from Iraq. So it's a very, as you say, complicated process. But there is coordination with the resistance factions there, and they themselves conceive of this in terms of what they call an escalation ladder. So just to give you one example of that, Hezbollah has a declared 5-kilometer depth from the border into Israel, which is part of its military operations, and it will not go beyond 5 kilometers unless and until there's specific Israeli escalations, which there have been some of, at which point Hezbollah has gone beyond the 5 kilometers and broken out some of its slightly longer range missiles. But I don't know if people understand this, that Hezbollah has thousands and thousands of medium range missiles, not one of which has been used in the conflict so far. Now, these medium range missiles can reach as far as Tel Aviv and indeed Jerusalem, so they can reach almost the entire territory of Israel. And these are much more significant missiles than the ones which Hamas or Palestinian Islamic Jihad are able to field from Gaza. So there is a massive hinterland of weaponry and strategy which has not yet been used in this case. And if the escalation happens, then it's going to be very serious. But it shouldn't be imagined that Israel can just continue with this campaign of assassinations, the 4 separate mass killings that one of them was one person, which they have done in the last week or so. There will be a response, and responses have been, it's been noted in Iran and in Damascus and in Iraq and indeed in Lebanon that there will be responses to these attacks, but they haven't come yet, and we wait to see, I guess, with some trepidation, what's going to happen as a result.
So that brings us, and thank you for that outline. I think that's good to have a perspective on what is the axis of resistance. By the way, when I talk about this with some of my American colleagues, David, they really don't know what I'm talking about. That to me is quite shocking. But anyway, that's for another discussion. So let's get back to Gaza. Israel's objectives when they launched this shock and awe campaign, which is now ended up in potentially the international courts of justice now, with South Africa invoking the Genocide Convention. But they said we're going to end Hamas. They laid out all these objectives, David, and it doesn't look like, maybe you can elucidate a little bit more on this, that they've achieved any of those. But it's all couched under messaging. There's a series of standard talking points. One of them is Israel has a right to defend itself. Okay, let's start from there, because that point is going to be the argumentative point that begins the International Courts of Justice trial when it eventually comes. the Israeli defense, more or less, will be, leaned on that point. This is all part of a broader discussion about propaganda, but let's try to understand this a little better, David. But go ahead.
So, it's been my contention is that what they have done in the last 10, 12 weeks, however long it is now, has been born out of a sense of powerlessness and a sense of bloodlust, essentially. They want to kill as many Palestinians as possible. And there's a strategic element to it too, which is, of course, that they want to drive the rest out. And it's bloodlust because they feel powerless, because they know that they cannot defeat the resistance factions. They haven't even defeated the smallest of the resistance factions. People don't know, I guess, that there are eight or 10 resistance factions. So, I mean, in addition to Hamas with the Qassam brigades and the Palestinian Islamic Jihad with their Al-Quds brigades, there's, of course, the PFLP, another faction of the PFLP, the Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine. There's the Mujahideen brigades, there's the Popular Resistance Committees, etc., etc. So there's a huge number of organizations there, including, of course, let's remember, the Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigades, which is an armed group which would appear to have some relationship to Fatah, which is the organization which, of course, leads the collaborationist Palestinian Authority. So you have an extraordinary range of groups there, 3, 4, 5 of them, perhaps secularist and maybe formally Marxist, and the rest of them all Islamically orientated. And they're all working closely together, as I said, in an operations room within Gaza. And they haven't been defeated. If you follow the telegrams closely, you see there has been the occasional Qassam fighter killed, which has been announced, and perhaps they're not saying about some of them, but it's pretty clear that they haven't lost significant numbers of fighters, whereas it's very clear that the Israelis have lost very significant numbers of fighters. They're claiming, I think, that they've lost something like 160 by now. But it's very, very clear if you watch all the telegrams, that various different streams that come out from different sides, that there are some very, very serious losses of life which have been inflicted on the IDF. Something like 700 military vehicles, including tanks, blown up and destroyed. It's been suggested that 2 helicopters have been shot down in the last few days by the resistance forces. Each of these tanks contains 4, maybe more personnel. There have been really a large number of spectacularly planned ambushes. So, I mean, only in the last few days I've seen Qassam brigades talk about minefields, by which I think they mean previously planted minefields done weeks, perhaps months ago, and they just wait until the IDF is within those minefields and then they remotely detonate them. And that's leading to really very significant IDF casualties. And we're not seeing anything like a true representation of that from Israel. One way we know that, I think, is through the northern front. So Hezbollah have lost, I think, more than 150 of their fighters. And each time one of their fighters is killed, they put out, they've got a formal studio portrait of the fighter. They name them, they say where they're from. It looked from about a month ago that the IDF had lost something like 200 in the north. And there was a famous moment where an Israeli journalist, I'm not sure how they got into there, but they wandered into this container, opened the container, and inside the container, along the wall, like in bunk beds with 4 bunks, there was 30 or 40 dead bodies, which had not been announced by the IDF. Right? So we don't know what the total is, but they're clearly losing large numbers of people, and they're clearly losing. And so, of course, they had to remove the Golani Brigade 2 or 3 weeks ago, because, first of all, a quarter of its entire force was wiped out on October the 7th itself, and then another quarter was wiped out during the the ground incursion into Gaza. That's the elite, one of the elite battalions of the IDF. And then, of course, they just the other day removed 2 or 3 other groups from Gaza, probably to pivot to the north to Lebanon because they want to provoke Hezbollah and to try and bring the Americans back in. But they are losing very, very badly there. And it's quite clear that, I mean, even the Israelis themselves have said now, some of them, that they can't defeat Hamas. They tend to say it in terms like, we can't defeat an idea like Hamas. And of course, that's true. But what they also mean is that they can't actually defeat the practical Hamas and the other factions in the tunnels because they don't know about the tunnels, so it appears. They don't have the proper intelligence, and they are at risk of being ambushed at any moment in the territory which belongs to the fighters of Gaza.
They're running into the same sort of problems, David, that the Americans ran into in Iraq, that even the Syrian Arab army has run into during its long and dirty civil war over a decade in places like East Aleppo and various neighborhoods in Damascus and beyond that. It's very, very difficult to do urban warfare, especially if you're not able to counter the insurgency that's being waged against a conventional force. It's very worthy of more analysis. We're going to take a break. However, when we come back, I want to talk about what really happened on October 7th and how that was used, the disinformation, the fake stories, the fabricated reports, and how they were used to motivate the Israeli state, the armed forces, and to get the backing of the international community. Why is that significant? We'll discuss that with David Miller, our guest, after these messages. I'm Patrick Henningsen, your host. This is TNT, Today's News Talk. We'll be right back. Now, David, before the break, we sort of introduce a potential segue here. Let's talk about October 7th, but the phenomenon of October 7th, or 10/7 as it's been rebranded, like 9/11, the messaging that's come out. And the motto of I used to think this was possible some sort of construct or something, but the motto of Israeli intelligence services is, if I'm not mistaken, the translation is, by deception thou shalt wage war. But the Mossad intelligence services. But isn't that what we saw on October 7th? The massive campaign, all of these fantastic stories that came out. That's really what motivated, and in the end, what provided the seemingly provided the justification for this massive military, the carpet bombing, the ongoing genocide in Gaza. The international community rallying behind Israel immediately after, many in the international community, not all, many. But just explain to us what happened here, because David, if true reporting, would have held the day there and people would have waited and been a little skeptical as to some of these claims, I think it might have changed the overall conversation. But that didn't happen, unfortunately. Go ahead, David.
Well, it didn't happen, and it still, in a way, isn't happening. Let me explain what I mean by that. So, when the resistance forces broke out of Gaza, they broke out by bulldozers, bulldozing fences, by light aircraft, hang gliders perhaps is the terminology, flying over the fence. Some of them came by boat. There is actually a Qassam Brigade's underwater sub-aqua division as well, which we've seen in some of the videos which have come out since then. And what they aimed to do was certainly to attack the IDF, the occupation forces, and then to get hostages as well. But it looks like there may have been an aim to actually reach the West Bank, and they were, in the end, they went through settlement after settlement, and they were really not very far from the West Bank by the time they were sort of repelled. It took a long time to repel them. Now, just to go on to what happened, of course, the official story was 1,400 dead and many hundreds of civilians among them. And of course, what then happened was, the story went on, was that we had reporting on who these people were who were dead, and whether there was 250 or 300 at the festival, which was right beside the Gaza fence, and how many others had been killed in various of the kibbutzim For example, in particular, kibbutz Be'eri, which is one of the main places of confrontation. And Haaretz, the liberal Zionist newspaper, was compiling the data and the names of all the individuals who had been killed. And of course, after a while, it became clear that 1,400 people hadn't been killed. The Israelis then conceded after a while that 200 of those who had killed had been resistance fighters, and they had been so badly charred in the most instances that they were unable to recognize that they were resistance fighters. And there is the clue, which we'll come back to very shortly. So that left you with 1,200, and then of course the figures were revised down again to 1,000. And of those 1,000, I think 371 were IDF or police or other security personnel, armed militia members from the kibbutzim, because of course the kibbutzim, all the kibbutzim are armed. So you had something like, I don't know, 500 or 600 alleged civilians killed. And then it became apparent that what was happening, well, there's two things to say. One, then of course, let's deal with the question of atrocities, first of all, and come back to the civilian deaths. First of all, atrocities. So there was mass rape. A woman's pelvis was broken because she was raped so violently. Another woman had her breasts chopped off, etc., 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 mass rape. And it was even said by the Israelis that particular Hamas commanders had been given the names of particular female IDF personnel to rape, and stuff like that, which is then of course quietly removed from the various reports of it. And of course, there was also the question of the beheaded children and babies, and it was said there were 40 children or babies, some of whom had been beheaded, and sometimes they said all 40 had been beheaded. And then, of course, that story collapsed. Like, both of those stories have collapsed. The beheaded story collapsed quite rapidly, but it didn't stop the Israelis making use of it. In fact, to this day, there are still Israeli propagandists talking about beheaded babies or beheadings. And it doesn't seem to matter that everybody knows, or everybody who's paying any attention knows, that these are false stories. We know that there were no babies killed at all on that day. There was one child, I think, between the age of 3 and 7 who was killed, and then I think Haaretz removed that from the figures. Anyhow, no babies were beheaded. There was a story about a baby being baked in an oven. That turned out not to be the case either, and all of that story fell away. Similarly with the rapes, the stories on rapes were quite quickly dropped by the Israelis until much more recently they were brought back by that New York Times investigation. Sourced to various people and individuals, which of course has been very effectively debunked by Max Blumenthal and others at Grey Zone and other independent journalists. So all of these stories of atrocities, almost without exception, have been debunked. It doesn't stop the Israelis from trying to use them again and recycling them and giving them to the journalists again, who then pretend that this is new information, when of course it's not. So that's the atrocities. Now the civilians, of course, what happened with the civilians, and we still don't know exactly what happened, but what we do know is that there's a directive inside the IDF called the Hannibal Directive, which was previously secret, which only became public some years ago, and it was then revised at that stage. And the Hannibal Directive means that there's a permission is given to the IDF to kill hostages, should it mean that they are able to kill terrorists, i.e. resistance fighters, at the same time. And so people started to conjecture, was there any sense in which Hannibal had happened or been authorized on that day? Well, what would the evidence be for that? Well, the evidence, of course, was that, first of all, we found out that tanks had been used in kibbutz Be'eri and other places. They'd been shelling houses. And at which point it becomes apparent that the reason why the bodies are charred and the houses are burnt to the ground, when the resistance factions are armed at best with light weaponry, maybe RPGs, etc. So it became apparent that all the burning and the incineration was, first of all, from the tanks, the shelling of tanks by tanks of kibbutz buildings, and secondly, of what seems to have been a massive firefight of Apache helicopters. Now, they were shooting apparently grenades, but also Hellfire missiles. I mean, Hellfire missiles are really very significant weaponry, and they were shooting Hellfire missiles at anybody who moved because they didn't have any intelligence. Because, of course, in Alex the Flood, the first thing that the resistance fighters had done was to disable all the intelligence. They were blind, and so they just shot at anything that moved. They weren't being given targeting advice, and of course, what that meant was that they killed very many civilians. And anyone who's seen the video footage put out by the IDF itself of all the cars recovered from outside the festival, almost all, I think, from outside the festival. You can see there's something like 300 or 400 or 500 cars, and maybe half of them have been incinerated. Now, probably without exception, those incinerations have been accomplished by Hellfire missiles or possibly tank shells being fired at cars with festival goers in them trying to flee. And of course, there's some examples, isn't there? I mean, I don't know if you remember, there was footage at the time of people running on foot to get away from the festival. And that was because they realized if they got in their car and drove north, they would encounter armed police who'd block the road. So many of them went the other way, at which point, presumably helicopter pilots assumed that they were Hamas or resistance fighters and simply killed them all. So very many of these civilians, we don't know exactly how many, whether it's half, whether it's almost all, were killed by the IDF themselves. And of course, there's very little recognition of that in the mainstream, although it's pretty clear if you read in detail the accounts. Now, it's clear that the resistance factions did kill some individuals. Sometimes they were, as the resistance factions themselves put it, by mistake, and in other cases because they were resisting the actions of the resistance fighters. So it's clear that they did kill some civilians, but it's also clear that by far the most significant evidence we have of killing civilians is of the IDF itself doing those killings. But when I said at the beginning, but it seems not to make any difference. Both with the rape claims, less with the baby beheadings, but certainly with the baby baking in the oven claim. These are claims which come back time and time again. It just seems to matter how many times they're debunked, and sometimes they're given to the media again by the same sources who have been discredited by proper investigations by investigative journalists and independent journalists. But nevertheless, they don't give up. It's like we expect people to play by the rules, and if they found out, if they're found out to be lying, they'll say, "Oh, okay, sorry, we got that wrong." But no, there's no such admission. And that's, of course, the difficulty is that wave after wave after wave of the same stories being recycled, and it gets traction in the mainstream. And of course, this is the premise of your question, it helps to legitimize the genocide. It helps to make sure that people like Joe Biden or Rishi Sunak or other Western leaders will go along with the claims. Remember, Biden's White House had to walk back the claims he'd seen the photographs of the beheaded babies. Of course, there were no such photographs. So it helps to legitimize that, and it helps to make it more difficult for people to hold their leaders to account in the West. And it insulates them to some extent from popular anger. And there's a very great measure of popular anger in every Western country as well as in the rest of the world.
There's two things that you've just revealed there, David. One is that the Israeli military is not very well trained, not very well organized, and a little bit ham-fisted when it comes to avoiding civilian casualties. Of course, that's now become a sort of unfortunate low standard that they have established now in history with Gaza. And that's going to be adjudicated hopefully in the World Court. But the worst thing here, David, is, and of course you can speak to this, I'll give you your final thoughts, yet another propaganda-driven war, a mass atrocity based on fake news, based on emotive propaganda in the immediate aftermath. David, final thoughts, and we'll break for this segment, but go ahead.
So, of course, since October the 7th, we've seen this. I've used the word bloodlust several times now, but it's really bloodlust. And because it's because of their fury that they know really that they can't defeat the resistance factions. And of course, they still have this plan. You know, I mean, we've seen the leaked documents, haven't we, of the architects planning the beachfront apartments where there used to be Palestinian homes. And we see that that's part of their agenda, that they want to remove all the Palestinians and then take control. But of course, that's not really on the agenda. The US doesn't want that. And they're talking about what's going to happen after Gaza is pacified. But it doesn't look like Gaza is going to be pacified. And so I think that we're in for another long period of propaganda. But I think what's happened in the last 2 months is that for many, many millions of people, the mask on what Zionism is has slipped. And people now see, many millions of people more than previously see, that Zionism is incorrigibly, fundamentally racist. Its very nature is about ethnic cleansing, and of course thus about genocide. And that is something which they can't put back in the box. It doesn't matter how much propaganda they devote, how many Western allies they have to back them up. They can't put that back in the box because millions and millions of people see the truth about Israel. And that means, in the context of a weakened US, that they're going to lose. And of course, this is, I suppose, this is
we're running out of time. Yeah, we're out of time, David. But David Miller, at Tracking Power on X Twitter, co-host to Palestine Declassified. David, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
We'll be back. Top of our news headlines coming up.